name is Amber, and it is my absolute pleasure to welcome you all to Suitable Conversations at Sunder Nursery, which is now back after a brief hiatus. At a suitable agency, our love for all things books is what inspired the idea for this series, and we are extremely grateful to Sunder Nursery for their enthusiastic support and encouragement in making this happen. Without their collaboration, this series would not have been possible. And now for the event we've all been waiting for. William Dalrymple will be in conversation with Maya Jasanoff on the Company Quartet and the writing of history. The quartet comprises four of Dalrymple's best-selling and prize-winning books, The Anarchy, White Mughal, Return of a King, and The Last Mughal, which together tell the story of the East India Company from its founding in 1600 to its nationalization in 1858. Before we proceed, a few words on our esteemed speakers this afternoon. William Dalrymple is a best-selling author of the Wolfson Prize-winning White Mughal, the Duff Hooper Prize-winning The Last Mughal, and the Hemingway and Kapuscinski Prize-winning Return of a King. His most recent book, The Anarchy, was longlisted for the Baillie Gifford Prize 2019 and shortlisted for the Duke of Wellington Medal for Military History, the Tata Book of the Year, and the Historical Writers Association Book Award 2020. It was a finalist for the Kandil Prize for History and won the 2020 Arthur Ross Medal from the U.S. Council on Foreign Relations. Maya Jasanoff is the Coolidge Professor of History and ex-Lee and Nancy Yang Professor of the Arts and Sciences at Harvard University. She is the author of the multiple prize-winning books Edge of Empire, Liberty's Exile, and The Dawn Watch, Joseph Conrad in a Global World. She has won numerous awards for her body of scholarship and writing, including a Guggenheim Fellowship and the 2017 Wyndham Campbell Prize for Nonfiction. She was chair of judges for the 2021 Booker Prize and is a frequent contributor to publications including The New Yorker and The Guardian. And with that, without further ado, please give a warm round of applause for our speakers.
Let me thank you all for coming on this very nice afternoon, and I want to acknowledge that although it's a very nice afternoon here, it is very far from a nice afternoon in another part of the world that many of us are probably following very closely. And the topic that we have under discussion today is, of course, William's books about the company era in British Indian history, but this is, of course, a topic about imperialism, and I expect that over the course of our conversation we will move from starting with these books and get, by the end, to thinking about some of the implications of this period of history for the present. But let me kick off by, it's to see you here. We've had a lot of these chit-chats over the years, but and I should say that these chit-chats started about 20 years ago when you were starting to write what became now the first of these four books, namely White Moguls. And I wanted to ask you, at what point in the course of writing these books did you start to think, gosh, I'm actually sort of writing a series. Maybe this is a set. Yeah.
So, well, first of all, thank you, Maya, for agreeing to do this. When we first met, Maya, I think, was still working on her PhD. We met in the India Office library over a card index 20 years ago when I was working on my first White Moguls. And we ended up actually going on a research trip together to France. Maya, always the better linguist and always actually sharper in every conceivable way, ended up having to do all Claude Martin's letters in French while I got away with doing the English correspondence. We went to the Savoy archive and found all sorts of stuff. And it ended up in your, first of all, in your PhD, and then in your wonderful Edge of Empire. And since then, I've had the humiliating experience of seeing Maya shoot past me and become... she was introduced formally as the Coolidge Professor, but clearly the coolest professor of history around, with not one but two Harvard professorships to her name, which means that she matches her parents, who have one each. So she's a sort of double barrel of Harvard intellectual sort of, I don't know whether it's appropriate to talk about Scud missiles today or use any of these metaphors in the light of what's going on, but it's been wonderful having you as a friend, an ally, an advisor, and help over all these years. And I am a huge fan of your work, and we hope this will be a conversation going two ways, discussing both sides. But to answer your question, by the time that I came to publish White Moguls, I had very much considered doing it as a quartet, but it wasn't this quartet. in actual fact. And I think it even says somewhere in either White Mughals or the last Mughals introduction that it was going to be a Mughal quartet originally, of which last Mughal would have been the last of four. And it only really became the Company Quartet sort of with, I suppose, Return of a King. And then I knew I wanted to go back and do the Anarchy to bookmark it. Where I think I've been very lucky is that, well, two or three things. First of all, when I arrived in India, there was very little narrative nonfiction being written. India was winning every single fiction prize going. Arundhati Roy just got the Booker. Kiran Desai just got the Booker. There was this extraordinary sensation that India was absolutely where it was in 2000, at the centre of the literary world in terms of fiction. But on the equivalent non-fiction list, there were no Indian authors at all, even being shortlisted or longlisted in prizes that you and I have competed for, like the what used to be called the Samuel Johnson, now called the Baillie Gifford. I think in the entire history of the prize, only Ram Guha and Samant Subramaniam are the only two Indian authors to be even longlisted for that prize. And it's a very interesting disparity. I don't know why that is, why India is quite so spectacularly good at fiction and winning fiction prizes, and why there's so much less of a tradition of writing history or biography in a literary manner. There is an academic history tradition that's very, very strong, with innumerable great historians recognized around the globe. But unlike many of your Harvard colleagues or yourself, who, as well as writing academic papers for each other, will also write books that they would hope would win Pulitzer Prizes or Guggenheim Fellowships or Campbell Johnson Prizes, or all the many accolades that you have already pulled off at your tender age. There is a tradition of reaching out and using scholarship. An example that stands out is The Swerve, a book written by arguably one of the greatest Shakespeare scholars in the world today, but a book which also won the Pulitzer Prize and was #1 on the New York Times bestseller list for 9 months. And while there are many, many Indian fiction authors who've won the Booker, been shortlisted, there isn't an equivalent at the moment, Indian non-fiction writer doing that. And so I was lucky in that while many of my contemporaries, like Simon Sebag Montefiore, who was the same year as me, for example, at Cambridge, and many others, Neil Ferguson, who you've worked with, though differing in politics, were doing this in the States. There was no one here doing that at all, bizarrely, and so there was an open field in a sense. There was an absence, and clearly among readers here there was a huge appetite for history that was written not for the seminar and for other academics, but were written to be read in the same way that you might read a Salman Rushdie or a Paul Auster, or any or a Zadie Smith, a serious literary work, but written in non-fiction rather than fiction. And I was very lucky in that, I think. The second thing that's happened over the years is that colonialism, which was always a hot topic here, and was always something people felt, for understandable reasons, very strongly about in India and in the Indian diaspora, was a subject which, certainly in America and in Britain, was not as central 20 years ago as it is now. And there's a huge amount more being written in the last 20 years, particularly in Britain. You see now, suddenly, belatedly, 75 years after 1947, the British waking up to the possibility that their empire was exploitative, looting, took away people's freedoms. The British have had an amazing capacity, which you would not believe if you were brought up here and have not gone and spent time there, to believe that their empire was benign, that the railways were a gift, that they were there. And this whole fantasy of the benign empire was alive and well, and is in the Tory party to this day. So that's happened. But then a third thing has happened, which is that the whole issue of the big corporation has come now to the center of attention. Shoshana Zuboff's book on data harvesting, this idea that corporations like Google and Facebook and Microsoft, the big oil companies, Tesla, companies like this, all of which have annual turnovers equal to whole European nations, never mind and whole chunks of Africa. That these entities are potentially, I mean, while obviously, generating wealth, providing employment, and doing many other positive things in the world, and in the case of like Apple, providing our computers and so on, that these corporations potentially can be very problematic entities that can exploit, that can topple governments, that can lobby or corrupt. And so suddenly the East India Company, I think, far from being a sort of, an interesting piece of history, talking about something that happened 300 years ago, can increasingly be seen as something which has lessons for our day and which is of interest not just to the immediate group of people either interested in India or interested in colonial history, but is of a pressing matter of our time.
So just love to offer a couple of reflections on what you just said before digging into a little bit more about the history of the company. This question of historians writing for audiences beyond the university is one that's, of course, very close to my heart because I am in the university. And I think that there is some clear truth to the fact that in Britain, there has long been a narrative history tradition. We can trace it back to the likes of Macaulay, Gibbon, even before that, that deliberately seeks to merge the sort of scholarly findings of academics with an accessible form of writing. And for much of the 19th century, in fact, history was written as literature. And that is certainly a distinctive thing, I think, about Britain as compared to, as you say, the writing of history in India or the writing of history, indeed, for quite some time in the United States. I do think, though, that this point that you make about, fiction writers from India sort of making it internationally in a way that history writing has not, I think there are many other sort of interesting layers to reflect on about that. I mean, one, of course, has to do with the industry of publishing and the sorts of things that it markets and picks up. And there's a good amount of debate, I think, about the kinds of novels that get picked up for international audiences as opposed to the kinds of novels that might be of more interest to Indian readers. So that's a sort of interesting division to think about. But another one would be that the kinds of resources that one needs to write history are rather substantial. I mean, one needs a lot of time. One needs to be able to access archives all over the world. One needs to, be able to, I mean, if one is in an academic position in India, the amount of time free to do writing at all, I think is rather limited. The amount of time and money available to go travel abroad and look at archives is virtually nil. So I do think that there are sort of structural factors that are involved here. I think in your case, one of the things that's wonderful is to see that there is this appetite, and now a whole bunch of other historians coming up starting to fill that, which is
very
great.
Nice to see a younger generation here coming out. In the last month, I don't know if any of you have read Anirudh Kanasetti's extraordinary book, Lords of the Deccan. But if you haven't, go out to Carl Market immediately and go and buy it. It's an absolutely spectacular example of someone taking a lot of really dry as dust specialist scholarship, which no one outside academia had ever read.
Yeah.
On guilds, on kingship, on medieval warfare, and spinning it into gold in a miraculous way. It's just apparently had its. I heard that it just had its second reprint this morning.
Wonderful. Yeah. Well, the other thing that I wanted to add is that as a person who's been writing about the British Empire based from the United States, I have seen, and as a person of Indian origin myself, I've seen how India has made very little impact on American readers' interests for a long time. You have found this, where your books are far more successful in India or in Britain than they are in the United States.
Bizarre parts of the world where people, huge interest in Italy, huge interest in France, very little interest in Germany, a lot of interest in Australia, none at all in, very, very little.
Exactly. So I would just add that that's yet another sort of factor in the relative sort of possibilities for writers to work in different veins. And so all of this is a way of saying that to some extent, the power dynamics that were responsible for imperialism and then encouraged and enhanced by imperialism are still sort of, latent in some of the kinds of dynamics that we see about who is able to write histories and where and how they land
The other, I mean, just this year, I've been made a fellow of the Bodleian at Oxford, and got access for the first time in my career to an academic database without having to,
Pay for it.
try to pay for it. Exactly, that's the word I was looking for. And again, the kind of miracle that opens, to be able to open your laptop now, and the Oxford Solo system, effectively every single academic paper ever written, immediately available there and then to download in seconds, is an extraordinary thing. And again, this, if you are Anirudh Kalasetti setting off in Bangalore without an academic or without money to huge amounts of resources to fly off to the India Office Library, or even, difficult to spend a month in Tonk looking at Mughal manuscripts, or the Bikaner, where I was this time last week in the Rajasthan archives in Bikaner. It does require resources, and in many cases, it requires some sort of academic passport to get access to the raw materials. So yes, it's a very good point.
Yeah, and I've long thought that, I mean, one of the wonderful things about our latest era, if you will, of globalization, there are many negative things about it that I'd be happy to talk about, but one of the nice things has been that digitization has made it possible to access all sorts of things from, sitting wherever one is sitting in one's home office, or not even home office, just one's home, in this era. And I've long believed that it's one of the responsibilities of wealthy institutions such as my own to try to digitize things or foster the sharing of information across these sorts of borders.
Academia.edu is a wonderful thing. So many things now available for everyone, but lots isn't.
So this question of sources leads me to want to ask you about one feature that I think unites all of your books, which is that each of them hinges on rather large repositories of course, archival documents, in many cases not having really been mined particularly by certainly anyone outside of scholars before, and in many cases also in...
by scholars.
And also in many cases, of course, in the languages one would expect for such documents, Persian, forms of Hindustani before it split into Hindi and Urdu, various Afghan languages, and so on. And I know that one of the things that sort of behind the scenes has united your books here is your longstanding collaboration with the late Bruce Wannell, and I wondered if you wanted to say a little bit about that.
Yes, I mean these books are very much double acts, and I think everything really that is completely new in these books, everything that is completely new in the book is owed to Bruce, and in the case of The Last Mughal, to Mahmud Farooqi, who worked on the Urdu documents for the Mutiny Papers. Bruce was an extraordinary man. I'm sure many of you here have met him because he lived on and off in Delhi for 20 years with me writing these books. An extraordinary figure, one of these people that can pick up a language as easily as most of us can pick up COVID, or he had this facility to just. He was very musical. He had a musical ear. He could do the same with, you could look at a bit of sheet music and play a perfect Schubert sonata straight off. And he had most European languages before he ever came here. But then he lived in Persia for a long time, got very good Persian, left at the revolution, moved to Peshawar, where he started picking up South Asian languages. And he had an astonishing facility, which no one else I've ever come across, with the possible exception of a very, very few people in Aligarh and a couple of people in Delhi, have of just reading Mughal documents as if they were the Hindustan Times or a book fresh off the shelf of a bookshop today. It's Mughal Persian is something which, even when it is in printed form, is a gift very few people have to read fluently and easily, and lots of people who claim to have it turn out actually to have more problems than they perhaps admit. And I've come across all sorts of people who've been recommended to me to help with various documents who've been frankly unable to produce legible, comprehensible English from printed documents, from scribal shorthand and so on, even more so. Many of these documents are written in the equivalent of a secretary's shorthand, and there are, frankly, an ever diminishing pool of people that can really genuinely cope with this. Plus, there are huge difficulties of getting access to a lot of this stuff. I mean, even if you're capable and rich enough and allowed to get access to the stuff in the obvious repositories like the Indian National Archives or the British Library, there are places like I mentioned Tonk, where there's an extraordinary library of stuff where Bruce and I tried for years to get access without success, and then managed to after a change of government in Rajasthan, managed to pull some strings and were able to get access. And the last book, The Anarchy, used a Shalam Nama that exists nowhere else. There's only one copy, and it's in Tonk, and we managed to get it. But it's a struggle getting access to these things, getting them either copied or photographed, and then working on them slowly at home. And Bruce and I Bruce would read them fairly fluently, but even he struggled sometimes with the scribal shorthands, and often wouldn't understand things because he didn't know the history well enough, and we'd have to go through it minutely together. And that's what made these 4 books. All 4 of them rely on almost untouched Mughal sources. I mean, one of the other odd things in Mughal history is that there is huge concentration on the kind of great periods of history. Ashoka, the great Mughals, the freedom struggle. And then there are these periods in between, like the Sultanate, bits of regional history, anything south of the Vindhyas, which are much, much, much less studied and much. Anirudh's book is about the Chalukyas and the Rashtrakutas, who, I mean, there's been virtually nothing in print about 2 huge empires. The Rashtrakutas were regarded by the Abbasids as one of the 3 great powers of the world, and yet there's been nothing available about them in English for a generation. And so there is huge amounts of work to be done in this country on the incredibly rich history from primary sources which are difficult to get to, which few people have the language skills to read. And for periods like the late Mughals, which is what I was working at, each book I was dealing with huge numbers of Mughal sources which had simply never been touched. The most surprising of which was the mutiny papers in the Indian National Archives. And when Mahmood and I started looking at the Urdu works, about, I can't remember the exact figure, 30,000 scraps of paper documents gathered by the victorious British in 1857 to 8 from the rebel camp, from the Red Fort, and these documents were used in the prosecution of freedom fighters, of insurgents, of mutinists, sepoys, call them what you will, and so they were used by the lawyers, hanging anyone who'd been involved, and if your name was on one of the lists, the chances were that you would be strung up. And then they were put away in Calcutta into a tent, moved here, I think in 1911 to Delhi, and barely looked at. Each of them has got the original accession document, and there were a couple of stamps and few people writing Urdu biographies of Mughal, of Padishah Zafar and so on, have used them. But astonishingly, despite the fact that there was JNU and Delhi University and so on, almost no one had access the only rebel documents in existence. They weren't sitting somewhere weird like Tonk, they were sitting in the National Archives where you'd expect, beautifully catalogued.
So there's a few takeaways from this, I think. I mean, one is that, just thinking about conditions of access, of course, there are, I think for any scholar in India thinking about doing research abroad, visas would be the first thing that you'd think about as an obstacle. But there are others which have to do, as you say, with, things in private hands or things that are, just poorly cataloged and difficult to get to. One thing that the Indian government and various authorities do is put up a lot of red tape between people and trying to get access to things. It would be nice to see that broken down. It would be nice to see more things preserved properly and digitized. But then there's this really interesting underlying question, which is why had people not, one imagines, looked in as great depth at some of these kinds of sources, people who did have access and so on, as ultimately you did. And that raises a big question about the kinds of histories that people wish to tell and the kinds of histories that people wish to read. And I wanted with that to maybe ask you just a little bit about some of the content of these books, because really what they do is they span the 18th, partly the 17th, the 18th, and into the 19th centuries, the period in which British ascendancy in India was sort of first slowly and then much more rapidly consolidated, the period in which, of course, Mughal power declined, choice of words can be debated, and a period of time which also witnessed many, many substantial changes in the way that the British were thinking about imperialism themselves. So, one of the things that comes through in the, if we will, the first two volumes, although they weren't written in that order, the White Moguls and the Anarchy, is that during this period of, relative Mughal decline, relative company advance, we're looking at very complicated power dynamics in which Indians and Brits are interacting with each other in all kinds of complicated ways.
Very, very different to the high imperialism.
Exactly. And my understanding is that one of the things that's been most surprising for an Indian audience about William's books, although less surprising, if I may say, for historians of the British Empire, is the extent to which Indians were involved financially in some of the things that allowed the company to rise in Bengal. And one of the things that's been most surprising to Western readers, though perhaps less so to people in India, has been the extent to which this early, 17th, 18th century generations of British company agents were very sort of culturally and socially and personally mixed up with people in India. Can you elaborate a little bit on where you see that fitting into the dynamics of the histories that we wish to tell today?
Well, in a sense, there's two different sides to this. One is the whole question of the bankers, and particularly the Jugget sets and the anarchy. Generations of historians, largely Bengali, have known about the role of the Jugget sets in hiring Clive to get rid of Sirajuddaula. It was not Clive's idea to fight Plassey. It was a plan of the Jugget sets. This is undisputable historical fact, witnessed from 8 or 9 different angles. You have the French saying it, you have the various different British sources saying it, you have the various different Mughal sources saying it. And the Jugget sets, this is not the first time they'd done it, they had put Ali Verdi Khan on the throne, on the governor's Masnad in Bengal a generation or two earlier. But they decided that Sirajuddaula was a problem and needed to be replaced, and they hired Clive to do it. Now, that simple fact is something that you will find in virtually no Indian history textbook. The fact that Clive was basically an Indian employee when he fought Plassey, and he was questioned by this in Parliament because it was not something he was authorised to do. The mission he was sent on from London was to fight the French, and there'd been this intelligence mix-up, rather like the Iraq War, where just like the Iraq War was fought for weapons of mass destruction that never existed. So Clive got sent originally to Madras to fight a French fleet that had never been dispatched. The French fleet had actually gone to fight what you in America call the French and Indian Wars, what in Britain is called the 7-Year War. All that sort of, Daniel Day-Lewis stuff on Lake Huron with tomahawks and people rowing across lakes with all that, with Washington and the 7-Year War. And Clive arrived in Madras to find that there were no French for him to fight. That, in other words, he crossed the world for 5 months or 6 months for absolutely no purpose. There was no French fleet dispatched to attack Bengal. And then within a week of his arrival, by pure bad fortune for India, for Sirajuddaula, for the Mughals, the news came of the fall of Calcutta. The two were not completely unrelated in that the reason that Sirajuddaula had attacked Calcutta was because the British were rebuilding the walls of the city in order to face the French, because they knew that the 7-Year War was coming. He arrives, he recaptures Calcutta, and then he writes to everybody he's on his way back. He's done his job. Calcutta's been recaptured. Sirajuddaula is still in power, but has been defeated and is no longer regarded as a threat. And at that point, the Jugget write to Clive and offer him £1 million to topple Siraj-ud-Dowlah, and then another fat sum for the company as well. And it's a crucial bit of history, and it's been in scholarship for generations, and lots of I think a lot of Chris Bailey's students have worked on this whole business of the collaboration of Indian banking groups with the company, and the way that these Western capitalists and these Indian financiers found mutual interest and worked with each other in a way that neither the high imperial histories emphasized nor the nationalist histories after 1947. Yeah. So that was one story, and a surprise, because you don't expect Indians to pay for their own subjugation effectively. And yet that's a lot of what the story of the early years of the company is. And the various Marwari banking dynasties queue up to finance company wars. Why? Because they get their money repaid on time with interest, and it's good business. Plus, Calcutta, why they're there in the first place? Calcutta is like Dubai or Singapore today. There's no tax, and there's no, and so if you're a banker wanting to make a profitable business, Calcutta is an attractive place to set up as Singapore or Dubai is today. The second story, though, is a very different one, which is the degree to which British servants of the company arriving in a city like late Mughal Delhi or Lucknow or Hyderabad found themselves attracted to and pulled into the court culture of Mughal Delhi, this very open culture which absorbed Hindu and Muslim and was open to Westerners to a certain point. And they did write Urdu poetry. They did take lovers from around the city. They interested themselves and commissioned painters. And the whole story of the beginning of what's sometimes called company school painting is part of the story, how court painters trained in Murshidabad or in Patna or in Delhi, particularly the family of Ghulam Ali Khan and Mazhar Ali Khan, become painters working for Indophile British patrons, people like William Fraser or Anglo-Indians like James Skinner. So yes, you get this hybridity both at the level of commercial operations and bankers and company capitalists working for mutual financial interest, but you also get a civilizational pull, which is utterly different to the stereotypes that we've all been brought up for of no dogs and Indians on the Simla highway, no Indians in clubs, Curzon, Kipling, and that whole world where there is apartheid, there's complete racial separation.
So one of the reasons that these much more hybrid histories tend not to have been emphasized over the last 60, 70 years is that in the period of decolonization and its aftermath, different forms of national histories were being written. And the concept of a nation as a unified whole was something that was reinforced through these kinds of histories. One of the things that one quickly learns studying, for example, the history of 18th century India is that the category of the British or the Indians has nothing like the sort of coherence that we may attach to those sorts of concepts today. Instead, what we're dealing with are the legacies of that later period that you talk about, the legacies of the later 19th century, really into the 20th century, far more hard-edged, a period in which nation states had much more sort of solidified senses of national identity and purpose, much more solidified borders, a period, too, in which the writing of history became institutionalized in universities, among other things. And I wondered if we could talk just a little bit then, touching on the second two books of your quartet, which take on the 19th century side of the company story and take us really from a period in which there's a more, if you will, sort of haphazard, opportunistic, entrepreneurial kind of approach to what later will be known as empire building, and a replacement of that gradually by a much more state-driven, militaristic, centralized, and really sort of preemptively aggressive kinds of imperial rule. Talk us through a little bit about how you see this transition, if you see it as such, from a more, again, sort of commercially driven kind of imperialism to a more sort of militant, militarized imperialism?
The change, I think, happens when the company goes bust for the first time after the 1772 famine. For those that don't know the story, Bengal is an incredibly well-run, rich state, which is why the company wants to seize it and has 1 million weavers, making and vast quantities of the tax revenue for the Mughal Empire come from this one state. Not what you'd expect today, because we don't regard Bengal today as the premier industrial zone of India, but it was in the 18th century. And the company effectively asset strips it very quickly between, well, Plassey in 1756, then 1757, then Buxar in 1765. And by 1770, a famine breaks out, and the company not only doesn't bother setting up a single soup kitchen, it happily sends out sepoys into the fields and into the towns to gather taxes from starving people by force. And when they managed to gather full tax in 1770, the shareholders vote to increase their dividend from 10 to 12.5%, although they already know that around 3 million people have died in the famine. So extraordinarily shocking, greedy series of events. But this culminates in the company going bust in 1772 and being bailed out by the state in 1774, after which the state takes a sort of 50% share in the company, rather like Gordon Brown bailing out NatWest after the subprime fiasco a decade ago. And so the company moves from being this sort of libertarian monster to being a sort of, I suppose, what today we call a public-private partnership with the government appointing the Governor General and later the Viceroy from that point. So gradually you see the company moving from being a commercial operation run by merchants and a board of directors to increasingly a sort of quasi-governmental, semi-public organization with ever-increasing ties to the state. And this changes the nature of things. So Wellesley is sent out in the late 1790s with a view to basically, like a cuckoo in the company's operations, to use the company's army, which is twice the size of the British army. It's 200,000 men, when in 1799 the British army is only 100,000 men, to get rid of the French and fight British national interests. So you have this odd moment when suddenly the government sends in one of its own to use the company, not to further the company's own interests, but to use it for the nation state. So that's what happens when Tipu is taken out within a few months of Wellesley arriving, and this, he picks the war. I mean, very much like Putin this week, he chooses to go for Tipu, and again, like Putin in the run-up, comes up with lots of reasons why he redefines Tipu as this jihadi monster who is this creature that is a danger to the world, and then he goes for it and he wipes out Tipu, and Srirangapatnam is looted comprehensively to the enormous profit of all the soldiers involved in it. And from that point, the company becomes less and less a commercial operation existing for its own commercial profit or that of its shareholders, and more something allied to as what you called empire building. And so the whole nature of the company's assault on Afghanistan is very mixed between Russophobic, great game anxiety about Russia coming down allegedly through the passes, through the Khyber, and liberating India. That's a lot of the way, although it's completely fictional, because the Russians are miles away at this point in 1839. They haven't even captured Khiva, Bukhara, Tashkent, and all those line of caravan cities. So they're a long way from Afghanistan. They're not even at the northern border yet. But there's also tied up with that at this phase, in this hybrid moment, when it is both a commercial company and a government organ, a lot of equally woolly thinking, equally misplaced and badly thought through about using the Indus as a second Ganges. By the 1830s, there were steamboats running up as far as Allahabad, opening up to the company the markets of Upper India. And the idea was that this Afghan war would allow them to use the Indus in the same way. You'd have steamboats chugging up to Lahore. In actual fact, it was impossible because the Indus is a much more shallow river. You can get small boats up the Indus, but you can't get steamers. And none of the fantasy ideas that you see in the documents of the time about, selling Manchester cottons or whatever in Central Asia ever came to pass at all. So you have two sets of woolly thinking, in commercial and imperial, involved in the attack on Afghanistan in 1839. What was fascinating for me, and one of the reasons I wrote that book, is that it has uncanny and exact parallels with the last American and NATO-led occupation of Afghanistan, to the point that the man put in by the British in 1839, Shah Shuja-ul-Mulk, is the chief of the same clan and the direct great-great-great-grandfather of Hamid Karzai, put in by the Americans in 2001. And even more remarkably, the clan which brought down the British did more than anyone else to destroy the British, which is the Ghilzais, who are the kind of the marginalized cropping farmers, day laborers, and so on in the south of the Pashtun areas of Afghanistan. They today they massacred the British on the famous retreat from Kabul in 1842. And they are the foot soldiers of the Taliban today. And Mullah Omar was the head of the Hotaki Ghilzai who led the attack on the British in the same tribe who led the attack on the British in 1842. So it isn't just that there is a vague, generalized parallels between the two wars. The two wars are astonishingly alike, down to the same families being involved in the same fight in the same places for similar reasons.
So, we've been chatting with each other for 20 years, so we could easily go on, but I think we're probably reaching the end of our time. So I'm going to ask William a last question for me, but this is a way of priming you and the audience, if you have questions, to get those questions ready, because I'll turn to you very shortly. But the last question for me for now is, it's conventional for us to refer to the present world as a post-colonial world, especially sitting in a place like India. Do you think we are in a post-colonial world, or are we still in a world of empires?
Well, I think the last sentence of the Anarchy was actually cribbed from an article of yours and an edit you kindly did to an article of mine, where I remember you writing something along the lines which I borrowed, that the world has never been post-colonial and probably never will be. Your words, which I borrowed. And no, clearly not. The weak will always be preyed on by the strong. Powerful leaders will always try to improve their popularity by seizing their neighbors. And many people in this country feel very strongly that as do many people elsewhere, that the whole NATO attack on Iraq specifically, which had no link with 9/11 and no link to Al-Qaeda, was definitely a colonial war, arguably fought for either to, because it was on a hit list drawn up by the Project for the New American Century, Wolfowitz and the advisors who originally drew it up for the Likud party in Israel and then brought it to Bush after 9/11, or for oil interests. And many of the Republicans were tied up. These are ideas which are very widespread, and you can argue about them for a long time. But that it was a colonial enterprise and a question of power and empire, I think is certainly arguable. And in the same way, Putin's attack on Russia, Putin's attack on Ukraine, has clearly been about power. Ukraine is a sovereign democratic state. Its president was voted in with 73% of the vote. and the Ukrainians have as much right as any other nation, India, Britain, America, or anyone else, to choose who their friends and allies are. They have a seat in the United Nations, they're a recognized nation. If they want to become part of NATO, it's their choice, not Russia's. So yes, I think, and hence our job is of contemporary importance rather than just antiquarian interest.
Well, thank you, William. And with that, I will open it to the audience. I'm assuming that there will be some microphones going around. Indeed, there's one over there. And if you'd like to ask a question, just put your hand up. And
So hi, I just don't have any question. I want to share a short, what happened in my life with Last Mughal and White Mughals, the book. So I was pregnant with my kid who is here. They're 4 years old. So I was reading this Last Mughal, and every night when my husband comes from work, we used to discuss the history and this thing. Every time, I'm not lying, he used to kick from me, and he used to, from inside my mom, he used to actively participate in that. So I've tweeted the same few years back to you. So just I wanted to share this. So hope he.
My children felt the same way, if it's any help.
Hello, my name is Preet, and firstly, it's such an honor to be here with you guys and conversing like that. It's been an honor, seriously. And my question is that in the recent political dynamics in India, we have seen some of the Hindutva politicians have been emphasizing the fact that fact of massacre done by the Mughals on the Indians, and in between all that narratives, the massacre done by the Britishers have been lost. So, what's your comment on that?
So, well, first of all, I should say that I'm not a specialist on the earlier period of Mughal history. I haven't written the sort of books I've written on the 18th and 19th century about the period of Babur and so on. But my understanding is that it's a complicated and long history, and the history of Hindus and Muslims have episodes of extreme violence and temple destruction and idol destruction. It also has moments of working together, living together, shared festivals, shared food, shared poetry, shared language. And like the proverbial half full or half empty glass, you can choose to emphasize one or the other. When it's actually a very complicated picture. I'm at the moment writing about an earlier period of history where there's a similarly complicated dynamic between Hinduism and Buddhism. It's a different story. It's not the same story. But again, you have, clear periods when Hinduism and Buddhism are in competition for resources, and other periods when they become almost indistinguishable, and the same rulers are patronizing Hindu and Buddhist institutions. And there are cases in Southeast Asia where you have pictures of the different deities all muddled up together, like in Borobudur, you have pictures of Lord Shiva. So there is a spectrum of different relationships at different times. I'm going to say this clearly, and that there was enormous destruction in the initial period of the Delhi Sultanate. And anyone that goes around the temples of Madhya Pradesh will, for example, as I did this time last year, going around lots of it, will see enormous destruction. But in general, the Mughals were a much more complicated and less violent arrival on the scene 200 or 300 years after the initial Sultanate. And I was last week in Bikaner. Now, in Bikaner is very interesting because you have it's a strong Mughal ally. The history of Bikaner is one of fighting alongside Mughal armies. It's a Hindu Rajput kingdom. The Bikaner archives are full of Mughal sanads and firmans, but also Muslim works that were looted by the Hindu Rajputs from their conquest of Muslim principalities in the Deccan. So you have this sort of, ridiculous, in a sense, situation whereby Hindu Rajput soldiers are fighting a war for Mughal emperors against Muslim armies and taking the loot from there back to a Rajput state. So it's an enormously complicated picture, and to portray it merely and simply as a long history of attrition against Hinduism by Islam, or equally to give it a completely rose-tinted vision and say that it was always the unified unhappy relationship when it clearly wasn't, for particularly during the early years of the Sultanate, during the Khaljis and so on. So it's something that has to be studied in detail, very precisely. People should look at it case by case, battle by battle, city by city, age by age, and just like the company changes from being a commercial operation to a governmental organization, and then it becomes the Raj, and all three things are very different. So you find great differences in Hindu-Muslim religion. Maya, what's your...
Yeah, I mean, if I could just add to that, I mean, I'm also not an expert on the Mughal period at all, but a more sort of meta-historical point, which is that at the beginning of our conversation today, we were talking about the ways in which the concept of the nation state, as it emerged in the 19th century, has had a somewhat, blinkering effect on the kinds of histories that we write about, for instance, the 18th century, right? When I was coming up in graduate school, it was very common to say that the Hindu-Muslim, or just in general, communal divides in modern India had been fomented by the British, and that in fact, communalism had been nothing like as strong and nothing like as violent and so on before the British period. Now, you can imagine what the politics underlying such a statement were. It was very understandably, and to my mind rightly, critical of British imperialism.
It's that particular interpretation. So what I'm trying to say here is that the categories that are, shall we say, live in the political discourse of the present tend to have skewing effects on the way that we write about the past. And that goes for any moment in history, and that goes for any moment with respect to the past. And so, while I think that, for example, historians like William and I are always interested in thinking about how the present came from the past, because after all, I'm interested in explaining how we got to the world we're in today. That's quite a different sort of proposition from the sort of, ex post facto application of certain kinds of concepts like rigid religious categories or rigid national categories or rigid racial categories or whatever into the past. And so I find it fascinating to see how these categories can come into being and what work they do, but we always want to be mindful that they are themselves kind of products of a particular moment.
I think the other thing to be said is that the pre-modern world is a very violent place. And whether you're in medieval Europe or in Japan in the 15th century or in, take your pick.
Well, the modern world is a very violent place too. It's modern. It's violent in different sorts of ways.
But I mean, one of the interesting things I think that Ali Rood's book that I was talking about earlier, Notice the Deccan, is show how incredibly violent different pre-Islamic Hindu kingdoms were to each other, the way that the Chalukyas and the Pallavas and the Cholas attacked each other's cities and often destroyed them, leveling temples, leveling monuments, leveling whole cities. And the idea that the destruction of temples, destruction of monuments, certainly only Islamic armies did is nonsense. We really got to look at the Sri Lankan chronicles for the massive looting done by the Cholas in Anuradhapura, and all the things which people have been upset, understandably here, about the destruction of temples, taking of idols, destruction of seizure of treasuries, happen when the Cholas invade Anuradhapura and take all the goods back. A lot of them, and there's no doubt about this, because it's on the side of the big temple in Tanjore that Raja Chola writes along in Komi, and then later writes about how he later raids Indonesia, what's now Malaysia, Kedah, and various parts of Southeast Asia. So violence is not the exclusive property of any one religion. The violence we're seeing this weekend is two Orthodox nations, Ukrainian Orthodox, two Orthodox nations on each other, and this sort of warfare of religion on religion is as common as different religions.
Hi, my name is Rishabh, and first of all, this was an intellectually liberating conversation. Second of all, the question that popped into my mind in the first part of the conversation was that who has the agency to write about history? Is it the academics in their ivory tower and with their academic passports, as you had said, or the masses having access to the archives in this digitized period with their lived experience should also have a say in the entire thing. So who do we give the agencies to? So this was my question.
My view is that anyone should be able to write history, and we need to make the sources available for people to access them. And as I said, I think it's we have a great opportunity at the present moment with the technologies available to bring historical sources to a larger number of people than ever before. Just think of Google Books; it's already a tremendous resource. I do think that you just used the phrase lived experience. I mean, I do think that there's a difference between sort of what we might call history that's written from a personal vantage point, memoir, for example, and history that is done by looking at a bunch of sources and attempting to be, sort of rigorous about thinking about which sources are telling us what kinds of things and why, and, figuring out which ones are the exceptions and which ones are the norms and all that sort of thing. I think, in other words, that training to write history is important in the same way that training to do any kind of thing well is important. And so I believe that, for example, one of the things that one sees in India is that there's a sort of hierarchy of subjects that people are encouraged to study in school and certainly in university, and an idea that somehow it's more important or prestigious or valuable or difficult to study certain things over others. I would just invite people to think about what the consequences of that are downstream for the sort of intellectual culture and indeed popular culture that you have in a society where you've sort of decided that the study of history, or for that matter literature, is a somehow inferior or second-tier subject. So I say democratize access. I say teach more how to do things properly. And I say do everything you can to break down the kinds of cultural prejudices that make certain forms of knowledge, which are indeed of huge civic importance, be sort of denigrated and the kind of thing that then is described as being only in an ivory tower, when in fact every single one of us in this space, sitting right this minute in a historic location, and every single one of us is a historic actor, it is the least, if you will, sort of ivory tower-ish subject that
I do think that something, as I said at the very beginning, something odd was going on in India in the 70s, 80s, 90s, where no one was writing accessible history. It was very, very difficult. And there was, you had extraordinary work by Indian historians, but often written in the Danish academies. I'm thinking particularly of the Southern Study, enormously prestigious series with highly regarded around the world, but almost incomprehensible to someone not specially trained in that world. And there was no bridging going on, which has resulted in a widespread ignorance of history in this country. Hugely simplified understanding of much more nuanced and complex something, particularly this matter of Hindu-Muslim relation. And the full complexity and the full variety of it is not widely known. And you've ended up with a sort of world where leftists are accused of whitewashing completely a violent history, and on the other hand, where right-wingers are accused of obsessively focusing only on violence. And when the reality is complicated and can happen differently at different times, and the pleasure of reading history is to see all this in its variety. And there are moments when you will be appalled and disgusted by bloodshed, iconoclasm and destruction, other moments of deeply uplifting philosophical inquiry, of different cultures coming together, of philosophers from different religions, translations from one religion to another in mutually comprehensible languages, epics passing from one people to another, being adapted, new poems being recomposed from old stories. And all that is true in its rich variety.
I will just add one final thing about this, which is that, you say popular history wasn't being written in the 70s, 80s, and 90s here, which I'm sure is true. I would simply add that, if you think about India's history and what it was trying to accomplish, the emphasis was obviously going to be in different sorts of fields. Narrative history itself is in effect a product of empire. So one can see that there would be sort of reasons to wish not to get into it. But I think that this one of the things that makes me most sort of upset when I go into teaching environments is when I hear people say to me, "Oh, history's so boring," because they learned it in school as a series of names and dates that they were forced to memorize, and then they just had to drop them out word for word on an exam, and that was it. And that's what history gets reduced to in places where I think you sort of lose this kind of narrative, clothing for it.
I've learned over many years of our conversations to be very hesitant about ever contradicting you. But one thing I would hesitate would be this idea that narrative history is entirely colonial.
I'd say entirely.
But I mean, there are very rich Indian histories. When I was doing the Anarchy, this extraordinary 4-volume work, still very much in print. You can buy it in the town market, the Sermon Dakareen of Khaddam Hussain Khan, which is like reading Edward Said watching the beginning of colonialism rather than Said in the 70s looking back on something which has ended. Khaddam Hussain Khan is watching workmen who've done generations of work suddenly going out of a job because the colonialists don't want to have an Indian-style table or an Indian miniature or something. He's watching his own family who have fought in the cavalry not having a job because the new way of fighting is infantry warfare and so on. Babur's memoir, that's one of the richest. Whatever you think of Babur as a conqueror, his literary talents as a memoirist and as someone writing his own life and writing the first version of history. Extraordinary. And one of the great memoirs, The Equal of Peeps, The Equal of Anything. Without I will never again wrong. So,
I would merely say that, for example, the ascent of the novel is a form that came into its own in the 18th century, spread around the world, etc., etc. Poetry, for instance, has a huge and unbelievably rich kind of lineage in South Asia, right? The novel is something that's coming in a different way. So too, the history tome is something that's coming in a different way. Anyway, I think we have time for one final question, and I'll go to the lady sitting on the mat here with thanks for sitting on the ground for this whole time.
It's good for the legs. Hi, Maya. Hi, William. So your book, City of Jinns, made me laugh so much so many years ago. How do we maintain the light-heartedness in our expression towards everything happening in the world, Know it, because you see it again and again happening in history, but still you're able to be positive and hopeful in this moment and present it in a way which, makes somebody smile as well in between.
I think there is a thing of a young person's book. I was 24, I think, when I wrote that. Newly moved here, loving the strangeness of it. And there is this terrible thing that people's books get more boring and gloomy the older they get. And Naipaul is a good example of that. Naipaul's early novels are terrifically funny. But there are no jokes at all in any of Naipaul's last 20 books. Far fewer jokes in these 4 books than there were in City of Jinns or in Xanadu. I think go to younger writers if you want to find the light-hearted side of things. A gloomy response. Is that true? Maya's looking horrified at this.
I don't know. I'm just thinking about this because, of course, I think we all spend a lot of
time these days thinking about how we can find, lightness and hope and humor in our very difficult times. I mean, I can say that I suppose sort of generally I come back to a few things. I mean, one is that I am by no means a person who believes that history is always getting better. It manifestly is not. There are periods that are very, very difficult, and it depends entirely on where you stand. I do think, though, sometimes about just the opportunities available to people that weren't there before. And I think that, over the last few years, I've had a visiting professorship at Ahmedabad University, a new university, of course, in Ahmedabad. And I've been struck there at the sense of possibility and the sense of creation that is here, in India is there in Ahmedabad, that is actually in very sharp contrast to Harvard, where I teach, which is, of course, such a well-known, famous university. And in fact, there, people are sort of more anxious in various ways. So my point in this is just to say that there is, I think, hope in places that are kind of coming up and in people who are coming up, and that to me, one of the things that is always vital in periods of seeming darkness is going out and looking for the light and going out of the space that I'm in and finding other kinds of experiences out there, recognizing that I have the ability to do that. But you know, I do think that our interconnected digital era makes it possible for people to do that in more and more sorts of ways. And so I say keep looking.